Welcome back to the R3 podcast. As some of you may know, R3 recently submitted a detailed statement to the UK COVID-19 inquiry, a substantial 63-page document full of insights that simply wouldn't have been possible without the input of our members. A huge thank you to the 180 of you who responded to our survey. As the inquiry moves through Module 9, which focuses on the government's economic interventions between 2020 and 2022, we're pleased to share the results of that survey and reflect on what it was really like working during the pandemic and the lessons learned along the way. So with that in mind, let's dive into the detail with our guest speaker. Thank you for coming on. So, Grace, shall we start with some introductions?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kira. Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm Grace Whatman, a Senior Vice President in the Turnaround and Restructuring Services team at AlixPartners, based in London. I've worked in restructuring for over 6 years now. My experience largely focuses on contingency planning and insolvency mandates, having worked on a range of high-profile, complex engagements, including Travelex, Carillion, Farfetch, and more recently, the Cineworld restructuring plans.
Thanks, Grace. So let's begin with your experience during the pandemic. What was the most unexpected challenge you faced as an insolvency professional?
Sure. So from a personal perspective, it's safe to say there were various unexpected challenges we all had to face during the pandemic. I moved back home to my parents in the countryside, left my London rental. My brother's immune suppressed, so I wouldn't have been able to see him or my parents for months on end had I continued to stay in London. But professionally, I was working on a very busy, forever involving engagement. We were company advisors to Travelex, the global Forex provider, and we were still adapting to the use of Teams and Zoom, having gone from previously always being at client side or in the office as a team. So as a junior, trying to absorb information by osmosis as quickly as possible, with it being my first proper live restructuring, was particularly difficult. Sat in my dad's study in my family home, it definitely felt very lonely, and it felt like I was taking a lot longer than usual to get up the learning curve. But not only that, but coordinating sort of complex restructuring processes, especially those involving multiple stakeholders, sensitive negotiations, it became significantly harder in a remote environment, especially when you couldn't get the feel of how negotiations were going truly sort of behind a computer screen compared to having it out in the boardroom, which is what we were all a lot more accustomed to. I think that's probably why the deal nearly fell over a few times. It wasn't made easy for anyone involved, but we did get there eventually, and it was a real success story for the company.
I'm glad to hear it did work out in the end. So going back to the survey R3 put out to contribute to the UK COVID-19 inquiry, the survey showed a real mix in how aware business owners were of their options. Did you find most of your clients understood the tools available to them, or were you often having to educate them first?
So in practice, most clients didn't fully understand the tools available to them, especially early on in the crisis. So yeah, a significant part of the role shifted towards education and demystification before any real restructuring strategy could even begin. I mean, many business owners had misconceptions, believing, for example, formal insolvency was the only option, or that entering any restructuring process would mean losing control. Others overestimated how long the government support would last, leading to delayed decision-making. And what we saw was smaller businesses often lacked any in-house financial or legal expertise, so the education piece was especially important there. In contrast, the larger firms, obviously, they had legal advisors, but they still needed help interpreting what was viable in that highly uncertain environment. And our role definitely became sort of part-time advisor, part-time counsellor. It wasn't just about executing processes, but it was about building trust and helping business owners think clearly in a time of chaos. And for many, that proactive engagement made the real difference between recovery and collapse.
So let's talk about government-backed support schemes, the BBL, civils, and so on. Our survey findings show a shared sentiment that while support was rapid and helpful, it often lacked due diligence, leading to misuse or fraud. How did the speed of rollout impact financial risk or fraud in your view?
Well, the speed of the rollout was absolutely crucial in stabilizing businesses during the early pandemic shock, but that same urgency did come at a cost. Due diligence was deprioritized, which opened the door to significant financial risk, misuse, and in some cases, just outright fraud. For example, the BBLs had a minimum eligibility check based on self-certification. Lenders were encouraged to approve them quickly. The government guarantee obviously reduced their risk exposure, which in turn then reduced their incentive to scrutinise the applications closely. And that made the scheme ripe for misuse, from, inflating turnover figures to fabricating businesses entirely in some instances. And additionally, the presence of these loans often complicated restructuring efforts too. So many businesses were technically solvent only because of the BBLs or CBILS funds, masking real underlying viability issues. Plus, of course, the government guarantees created uncertainty around how lenders would behave in restructurings, particularly in relation to their ability or willingness to compromise on those debts. I guess the schemes undoubtedly, they saved thousands of viable businesses, but the trade-off was a spike in bad lending. It's a classic case of speed versus scrutiny, and while the intention was right, the long-term cleanup is still very much unfolding.
No, absolutely. And based on a lot of the challenges around the impact of financial risk when rolling these out so speedily, if there was one design flaw that you could choose to fix, which one would that be in particular?
It's got to be the lack of robust eligibility checks, especially in the BBLs, which allowed self-certification, like I mentioned before, without any meaningful verification. I mean, applicants could self-declare turnover and request loans of up to 25% of that figure with no requirement to supply evidence up front. And the absence of these checks created a perception that, I guess, the money was free or, unlikely to be pursued, encouraging reckless or opportunistic behaviour. Even a light touch verification system, for example, cross-referencing turnover with VAT returns or companies' house filings, could have flagged those irregularities without meaningfully slowing down any deployment.
What are you currently seeing in terms of BBL abuse, realization, and discussions with directors?
So right now, well, in the aftermath of the pandemic and as repayment deadlines have kicked in, BBL abuse is surfacing in a much more visible and structured way. The initial focus on business survival has shifted towards investigation, recovery, and accountability. There are an increasing numbers of insolvent companies where BBL funds are misused, for example, transferred to directors personally, used to repay non-business debts, personal credit cards, or even withdrawn cash as cash for sort of lifestyle purchases, cars, holidays, and I even read about crypto in some cases. And in many liquidations, BBLs are now the largest or only liability, especially for micro businesses or sole traders. And look, many directors are genuinely unaware they misused the funds. They assume the money could be used flexibly, or they didn't fully understand the loan terms under pressure. Others knew the rules, but hoped, I guess, it would all come good before repayment started. And since BBLs were unsecured and often already spent, the prospects of recovery are very low. We're dealing with a mix of honest misunderstanding and deliberate abuse, and that's reshaping how we approach direct conduct, claims strategy, and even public messaging around insolvency support schemes. I think the next few years will likely see more enforcement, more case law, and growing pressure to strike a balance between accountability and fairness for struggling business owners.
And it's often said hindsight's a wonderful gift to have when going through a crisis. So what's the one policy change you would advocate to recommend for if we were to head into another crisis?
I think it's got to be the need to build crisis support around a scalable framework that includes pre-approved, data-verified lending mechanisms, so speed doesn't come at the expense of oversight. So what does that mean in practice? Essentially, design a plug-and-play emergency lending infrastructure that can be activated rapidly but still leverages existing trusted data sources like HMRC records, company's house, open banking feeds, etc., to verify applicant identity and turnover automatically, to flag any inconsistencies in real time, and to set appropriate lending limits based on actual business activity.
That's been very insightful, Grace. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. You've really added that life experience to a lot of the thematic responses that we had received through our survey that we put out for the COVID-19 inquiry.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.